digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined once again by the lovely Pete from Dubbit and also Sanj Sarati, not from Hallucian anymore, but from Tiger Heart, which is his very own new agency, shiny and new, I might add. And we have with us newcomer this week, Mike Stewart from UCL. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello.
Right, so Sanj, for the benefit of our listeners, because you have started something new and it's all different, why don't you explain to us exactly what Tiger Heart is and exactly what your new title is, because I love your new title. Please do share what you do.
Yes. So, my name's Sanj, and I am the digital atelier and founder of a new agency which I set up about 2 months ago called Tiger Heart. I've been working in digital since about 1998, and I've been helping businesses engage with consumers in new and exciting ways using technology. I've seen the cultural shift of human habit and behavior as we all evolve into becoming the new digital consumer. Some of the successes I've been part of have been burgeoning, groundbreaking, and more importantly, culturally relevant. I feel that we're still in the early stages of this fourth industrial revolution. There are vast amounts of great creative technology and digital ideas that are being conceived, designed, and developed and delivered into the consumer space. And I feel that technology is now a part of everything that we do, see, and remember. It's exciting, exploratory, and for some of the companies that I work with, very frightening. I've set up Tiger Heart to help brands believe in new and emerging technologies and to prove that these technologies can be fun, human, and understood.
And it's very exciting times for you. I will also mention, just because you didn't mention it, I just love mentioning the fact that you were part of the team that was responsible for the two-pack hologram over at Coachella in 2012.
Yeah, well, it's I've been very lucky. I've worked with some fantastic, artists, initiatives, and brands, and that was one of a plethora of fantastic opportunities that I've been part of.
Wonderful, thank you. And Pete, why don't you remind our lovely listeners exactly what you do as the global head of Dubbit? Why don't you explain a little bit more about Dubbit and what you guys do?
Cool, yeah. So pretty much everything that Sam said, I think I'm going to steal and stick on my LinkedIn, because it was such a perfect summary of like where we all are in the digital business, except for I've never got to work with two-pack holograms, sadly. So Dubbit are an interactive agency. We develop digital products for children's media, so at the likes of PBS Kids and Lego and Cartoon Network, amongst others. I head up the research side of the business. It's basically a commitment from Dubbit to understanding the audience and making sure whatever products that we or our clients endeavour to kind of make and distribute are aligned with their needs, the audience's needs. And that's kind of cool for me because it means that I just spend most of my time talking to and listening to kids and going back to brands and giving them advice on how they can communicate and deliver content and products to that audience, which is good because I think, as Sanj is saying, tech is just such it's not even a thing, it's kind of an everything, and it's in the middle of every single kind of company we work with now. So how everything is changing, it's really important to be kind of relevant from a culture perspective, from a behavior perspective, from a platform perspective. So it's good fun at the moment.
Okay, and I don't think you should undersell yourselves here, because the Dubbit reports actually are showcased at things like Kids Screen in New York and also the Children's Media Summit. And you really are on the front line when it comes to the emerging trends of young people and sharing what's going on inside young people's heads.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way I'd say we give a lot of data away for free. I think, from my candy days, I mean, it's so difficult to kind of create and sustain kind of really great, genuine kids content. So, for us, it's really important that we try and get stuff out there and have sensible conversations with people like Sanj, create great stuff and to kind of make sure that there's good content for kids, because the scariest future would be a future with no content. Also,
from my point of view as well, a lot of the reports that, you've done, I use for some of my presentations. I mean, you guys are really, stirring the pot and stirring the kind of thought processes for people that wouldn't have thought about the psychology of kids and how they react to technology.
Most definitely.
Thank you.
So, Mike, why don't you introduce yourself to our lovely audience and explain exactly what a professor of anthropology does when they have an interest in the virtual reality technologies?
Good day, everyone. My name is Michael Stewart. As Tanya says, I'm a professor of anthropology at University College London. I'm here because for a number of years, we've been running an MA in ethnographic and documentary filmmaking. And part of the whole business of making documentaries is taking people immersing them in another environment, another world, especially the sort of cinematic documentaries that we try and get our students to make. And that led us onto an interest in and meeting with people who were creating especially immersive content in virtual and sometimes augmented realities. And in particular, because we run the Open City Documentary Film Festival in London, we actually built up industry partnerships with some of the companies developing this extremely exciting but kind of early form new content. So from October this year, inspired by those connections, and also inspired by the fact that being at UCL, we've got a really great computer science department with its own distinctive cave environment. We've got a fantastic Centre for the Advanced Spatial Analysis, which uses computer simulation to create models and maps of mass data, mass behavior. So inspired by all those surroundings, we're launching a new pathway in our MA, teaching people to think about what works, what doesn't, in terms of content in immersive and augmented realities. And so we've begun to engage much more than we have in the past with industry makers, technologists, with the whole emerging field of this. And indeed, because we're educating people, engage with the ethical issues around what happens when we share content and when we share other people's content. So yeah, that's me, Tanya.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And today, what I wanted to do was talk about the future of attitudes towards technology. And also, I think we'll get into a conversation probably about privacy further into this conversation. But I do want to start with just the attitudes towards technology. And I'm going to kind of throw this one at you first, Sanj, because I know you're very passionate about this. And I know that you've got some very clear views in terms of where we are at the moment culturally with the attitude towards technology, but where we're kind of headed towards as well is probably one of those areas of interest for you. So I'm curious from your perspective, Sanj. I know we've talked about this idea that technology is now very much embedded in the day-to-day life of pretty much most people. They're utilising some form of technology, even if that's something as simple as the wheel, which is in itself a technology. You know, a lot of people in modern society, you know, they think shiny computers when you say technology, but we're talking about any type of technology here. And I think you're very right in as much as it's now ingrained in everybody's life. But I'm curious from your perspective, where do you see the kind of transition of these technologies being less physical, clunky objects that we're interacting with and more on a kind of integration and kind of combining that with physicality of the body? Where do you see that going?
I guess there's a myriad of doors that we can open here, you know, with that question. Some of the things that I'm working on at the moment are really focused on just applying artificial intelligence to a user experience. Now, that could be something as simple as, you know, you using your television and you talking to your television, which, you know, is in the marketplace at the moment. But we're also working with brands that are trying to engage with consumers, predominantly within retail, in ways that are ultimately seamless. And the seamless aspect of that design is probably the most important part of these experiences that we have to create. And, you know, that kind of seamless treasure that we're looking for always takes a lot of time to get right. As you know, my time at Halicion, when I started there, we were making augmented reality apps where you held a device in front of something and something happened, you know, a smart device like a phone or a tablet. And very quickly, the kind of that process started to become a dirty and unseamless experience because people didn't want to download applications anymore. Mm-hmm. And we always had to think about, how do we make an experience as seamless as possible without there being any barriers, without there being any distractions? And that's a struggle that, you know, a lot of businesses have been having ever since Edison, ever since electricity was created. But where that kind of seamlessness starts to smooth out is when it starts to benefit the user, when it starts to, you know, become important. And I was thinking about this yesterday, actually. I was in London with one of my clients, and I saw one of those BMW i3s on the road. and it was plugged into, into one of those
charging unit things.
Charging units.
Yeah.
And I looked at that and I was like, that's really cool because, they're not using petrol, which some people believe is quite a nasty thing, but it looks really ugly. And then I started to think about the whole process of how people put petrol into their cars. And, it's not the most seamless experience, but it is quite a seamless experience. You drive into this, this forecourt, you park your car, you pull out the handle, you put it into your car, you pour in the petrol, and then you pay. That's what a seamless experience should be. Something that is has kind of been evolving to be seamless. And I think that process takes time with all technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's augmented reality, whether it's holograms, whether it's cars. Some of the holographic work I've done has been, absolutely, seamless, fantastic, and has instilled wonder. But, when I started working with holograms, there was a lot of crap that we delivered, and it was because it wasn't seamless. And I think when you're talking about embedding technology into the human body, that's something that's going to take a lot of time to develop. And there's people that have been doing that for a long time. There's new players that come into the market, like the North Sense guys, Livia, who's created that cybernetic implant that you put on your chest, and every time he faces north, it gets a vibration. But there's also they're investing billions of pounds into it, like Elon Musk, who announced Neuralink, which is something that has been in the minds of science fiction writers for donkey's years. But it's starting to get into the consumer space because someone like Elon Musk, who's a public figure, is bringing that to the market and getting people to think about that type of technology, and that's exciting.
Okay, so here's my thing. So as for example, I know that we've spoken about this one before, but things like Project Jacquard, which is essentially weaving at a yarn level, weaving in technology into the materials. And so then whatever you create from the materials has technology embedded within it is the most simplistic way that I can explain what Project Jacquard is. But looking at the first kind of consumer execution of Project Jacquard, it's basically a cycling jacket for cyclists to control the volume of their music by being able to gesture on the sleeve of the jacket whilst they're cycling. I'm not sure personally, for me, that was the best possible execution or use of something like Project Jacquard. On the other hand, I've got a piece of technology that I know that you've seen before, Sanj, when I've been out and about with it, but the curve ring that I've been using for almost a year now, which allows me to pay using my ring. It's an NFC chip inside the ring, and that's connected to a credit card, and that allows me to essentially travel around on things like the Tube, the London Transport for London network, on using Oyster to pay for, contactless credit card payments, so whether it's at the restaurant or at the shops. But that technology, I find that to be much more of a seamless experience than something that's kind of perhaps over-engineered in the form of the cycling jacket that's been launched. Because it's a thing that I have to do. I have to make a payment, but I've simplified the process of making that payment by being able to just do it just with a ring. So for me, that's actually one of the most useful technologies in my life. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective, Pete, when we talk about this kind of re-education, if you like, of a generation who are going to need to figure out how to interact with this technology, or whatever the technologies are, that allows them to do something that the older generation might have considered as a normal thing, but had quite a lot of steps or parts of the process to it. These simplified processes these young people are going to be engaging with, that's being facilitated by different types of technology. What is the current attitude to that? Because I know that Sanjay's mentioned there are 2 different projects that involved direct integration into the human body. Do you think that there's still a fear in younger people about that idea of integration of technology? I know that for the older generation, it was all very much a, let's keep technology at a distance kind of attitude. But as we've evolved with technology and things like the smartphone and wearable technology, do you think that that's something that younger people necessarily are worried about?
I think it's very, very different with younger people, because it goes back to that core principle that Sanj is talking about, which is, is it useful? Is it usable? They're the first questions that they ask. And I think, attitudes amongst young people, they've grown up with technology. They understand how to use it. Quite often they understand how to use it better than parents. They're their kind of quick tips and usage of it is more savvy than some older audiences. So I think that they're okay with the idea of adopting it. I do think there's still an element of trust that needs to be overcome. There's still some concerns that they shouldn't just trust everything, especially with the wider economic and cultural things going on in society, not around technology, but around governments and banks and everything else. There is that plays a factor in adoption. I think the really interesting thing right now is that a lot of the technology that's being developed is being developed so that firms, tech firms and content firms, can try things out and see how it performs rather than it being the best possible experience. And I think that's really interesting because kids use it from a very literal sense. If it's not the best possible experience, then they kind of dismiss it unless they can find a way of hacking it into their lives. I think it's when you see the younger audiences hack it into their lives, that's where you start to see it move from being a toy or a gimmick into a useful piece of tech. And I think kids are very quick at seeing if it's worthwhile and part of their lives. And if it is, they'll find the right way to use it. That's what we're observing a lot of. So I don't know if you saw Netflix yesterday launched their first kind of interactive story, so Puss in Boots, where you can basically read along. It's a video, and then you can click left or right and choose the direction the story goes into. Now, it's again, as an experience, it doesn't feel quite right, but you can do it. The tech's there. Kids love read-along stories, and you can interact, and a kid can interact with a connected screen. All of that fits together, and they're all going to try it. Is it going to be something they adopt long-term? Probably not, because I don't know if it's exactly the right execution, but kids figure it out fairly quick. But they're happy to give it a go.
Okay, so one of the things that you talked about there was the kind of attitude towards the kind of the gathering of data or the use of data, that there is more and more of a desire that the big companies want to gather as much data as possible about their users. And I think one of the interesting things is the attitude of these young people to their data. And I know that we've had this conversation before, Pete, about how young people actually understand that they have value, especially if you're looking at kind of the 13 to 16 age range. They understand that they have an inherent value, and they want to make sure that they get something back for that data that they're kind of sharing with these big companies. And I'm curious from your perspective whether or not you've seen more of that emergence, especially with things like YouTubers and, and Instagrammers and kind of social media influencers, who they understand their inherent value, that in a way that perhaps older people don't necessarily understand, that just because they happen to exist and they are sharing their data doesn't necessarily feel to them like inherent value. But for a younger person, they see that as a point of value, a point of exchange, if you will.
I think there's going to be this whole data capital, being kind of the currency of the future. I think is a fascinating conversation. From a kid's perspective, they balance that as part of their decision, because if a product like WhatsApp or Snapchat or whatever age kid we're talking about, or FaceTime, if it actually meets a need for them, I think quite often they're willing to overlook the data capital, because it has like the product has a real value to their life and usefulness in their life. But it is definitely much more a factor of their decisions on how they kind of give out their data. I think it'd be really interesting to see how kids react to the fact that they are well documented in social media before they actually are able to make a decision on that. So, kind of the 1 and 2 year olds of today in 10 years time, when they find out that they have been their parents have documented them for the last 15 years, I think that could be a very interesting period. Because kids are aware of safety, they're kind of bred on safety, they're more digitally savvy, they're differently digitally savvy. So I think that could create some very interesting repercussions. But it's the same as older audiences. If the product meets a need in their life, I think they're willing to overlook the data capital conversation, but they are definitely aware of it.
But it's an interesting point that you raised in terms of that desire for control of self-image. And it wasn't one that I think that the kind of, I'm going to say millennials hesitantly, but I am going to stick with this in terms of, I don't think millennials really worry too much about it. I think it is the generation behind them that are kind of looking at, the tender age of 12, for example, looking at their Instagram or their Facebook accounts that the parents have had and saying, I want you to delete that picture of me, or I want you to delete that post where you talked about something silly I did when I was 6 years old, or whatever the thing is. And we're seeing that trend of more and more parents, when their child is being born, starting out a social media account for them, even when they're literally a month old. It's quite an interesting, as you say, the idea of creating that identity for the child before they're even really aware that they have the digital identity. And I'm curious from your perspective, Michael, what you see as being the kind of the challenge around the creation of that digital identity for a young person before they've really even had an opportunity to kind of grow up or get involved in the world.
Yes, no, I mean, I suppose coming at this as an anthropologist, and since we, famously study the whole history of humanity, we're notorious for always saying, well, things change much less than they appear to at first, and that people find old solutions to new problems. And in one sense, when we're just as a child, when we're named, and when our families start to construct stories about us before we can talk back. And I mean, transgenerationally, so the grandparents, the parents, the aunts, the uncles, laterally as well, our reputation, our image, our identity is shaped by our environment in the pre-digital world. And I'm not completely sure that, yes, of course, there's a degree to which identity is more accessible to others once you have your own Facebook page aged 6 months and a kind of greater longevity and more easily distributed. But I'm not sure that the fundamental challenge of making your way in the world as a unique person and as part of your family is going to be really totally different. I mean, I was very interested in what Pete was saying because, of being of a kind of, sadly, the long pre-millennial generation. I'm often reading various Cassandras in the newspapers, professors of public understandings of science and so on, who rail against the kind of data mining of Google and Facebook and predict terribly dire futures, not only for all of us, but also for the industry, which generates this supposedly without any consent from the population. And it was just very interesting hearing Pete talk about the way that the younger generation are so much more aware, as you said, of the value they have and the value they can create, and of the implicit deals that are going on in this environment. Now, in terms of, coming back to your question, in terms of identity, obviously a 4-year-old has limited control over the social value that their parents are investing them in the Facebook page. And I guess you will find kind of backlashes against that. And I suppose that's more broadly, that's the risk in all this, that insofar as people are not aware of the full implications of sharing data, I think then there may be some kind of awful cataclysmic moment when people's data is used in some completely inappropriate fashion, and then there's a kind of backlash. If you think of the so-called organ harvesting scandal in Bristol, was that 20 years ago when dead babies' organs were being used for medical purposes by the hospital, but crucially they were being used without the consent of the deceased children's parents and families. And that's led to a complete revision of protocols, ethical procedures around the whole of university research and indeed medical research, all because of one single highly abusive case. If they'd thought about it beforehand, they could have avoided the whole issue. And so there is an air that you can see that there might be a kind of revolt of the 9-year-olds. Their prospects of getting into the school of their choice has been ruined by their families.
It is interesting, though, that you say this because we're starting to see some cases where actually people's choices on social media platforms are impacting their long-term viability, whether that's in employment or whether that's in education. And the recent case of the Harvard students, I think it was Harvard, where they were on a private Facebook group. So it wasn't public facing, but it was private. And they had been accepted into one of the classes for Harvard in a couple of years' time. And they had been posting very inappropriate jokes, which I will not repeat because they do not merit repeating. I refuse to repeat them. But they were joking and they were making some very lewd and very unsuitable jokes that really quite were offensive. And that information got back to the administrators at Harvard. And as a result, the people who'd been, engaging in that all had their offers revoked by Harvard. And so that's had pretty long-term impact on them in terms of they won't be able to get into certainly this year's intake of college. And if they were to reapply to another college, they're going to have to explain why they didn't get in, or why their invitation to Harvard was revoked. And so that causes quite a significant bump in the road of their academic career. And we've also seen examples of people getting fired from, whether it's high profile jobs or even, regular everyday jobs, people getting fired for the choices that they've made in terms of how they articulate their digital personality in social media. So I am kind of curious, Sanj, from your perspective, or actually I open this up to any of you, but from the perspective of the long-term impact of digital identity and the fact that I think for many people, especially people who aren't necessarily in the gaming environment or understand the gaming environment, they don't see their digital identity as an avatar. They see it very much as the representation of their true personality. Whereas I think social media savvy and gamer savvy individuals tend to think of it more as an avatar. You're more curated. And I think, Pete, you've commented on this before in the past, where there is that degree of curation of what people see and the persona that people get to see on these platforms. But then there is a certain group of people who don't necessarily differentiate. And it's perhaps those people that are at most risk when it comes to not understanding the long-term impact of what they're doing in these spaces. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, gentlemen.
Yeah, I can make a quick comment. I have two particular opinions on this. The first is, when social media started and the under 13 thing was created, that's fine, but we're still not having a realistic conversation about the fact that under 13s use social media products. It's a completely hidden part of social media because we can't have a sensible conversation about it. And that's a problem because some of those social media services aren't appropriate for those children. And if we had a realistic conversation about it and developed the appropriate products or the appropriate mechanics from those products, then they would be a great tool for people. And I think that's one thing. I think that's something we need to fix. The legislation needs to address that and approach it. And I know Mark Zuckerberg has made comments about copper and other kind of legislation like that. I think that's a big thing. The second thing is from a kid's perspective, because I think that they use social media, they manage their profiles very carefully, or some of them don't. Some of them are very open about it. I think that's a really good thing, that kids are able to communicate. I just think, again, we need the right protocols and legislation in place to protect them, but we also need the right education. So, I think at the moment with all this kind of negative press going on out there, even looking at Donald Trump and a lot of the social media things have been going skewed, but I just think people need to understand what's true, what's not true, what's opinion, what's not opinion, when's the right forum to voice. And at a certain age, it's difficult to, even at our age, it's difficult to do that working in the industry. So I just think that needs to be something that's educated, because it could become a problem if people don't know how to take things and how to kind of portray themselves.
Anyway, I'll just say my sort of, my own thoughts on your question are that really, people, humans, are reputational species, and this comes back a bit to your Harvard example as well. And we operate through trust in other people, and that trust is based upon reputation of various sorts, established in various ways. And in a funny way, and I was thinking as Pete was talking then, that in the past couple of hundred years has been a bit of an odd period in human history in which a lot of our lives have been led quite anonymously, especially in a country like Britain, where you may not even know your next door neighbours' names. But in the past, and before that, when people lived in villages, everybody knew everything about everybody. In African villages built on a circle with everybody's doors leading onto a shared square, or living in a longhouse in the Amazonian jungle. For most of human history, the past 250,000 years, your neighbours have known, how you fart, how you make love, everything about you, and what the things you don't like talking about, your lies, etc. And maybe we can cope with a much greater degree of transparency. Being in my late 50s, I don't like that idea, but that's because I've been socialized into this world. I wonder whether things can become more transparent in a positive way.
That's an interesting concept. Sanj, what's your thoughts on that? More transparency?
Well, I just think this kind of whirlwind of data that's out in the ether at the moment, that some people see as a problem now, should have kind of been thinking about that, 20 years ago when the digital revolution started. Because, we're in it. It's the reason why Google and Facebook know more about what's happening in the world than our governments do. And it's the conversations that people are having to make change are are executed in different ways now. And, to some people that's frightening, to some people that's exciting. I find it really exciting. But the reality is it's where we are now. It's data. It's not a currency that's kind of coming into, fruition. It's a currency that's been around for a long time. And there are lots of businesses that are taking advantage of that. I mean, one thing I would also add, though, just the great thing about technology and a great thing about, the things that are out there now that are being developed, whether it's, Project Jacquard or the Ring or Facebook or whatever it is that, people are expressing themselves in new ways. And that's, to me, that's more important. But, and Pete touched on this, there is a a responsibility to educate people. There needs to be education, not just, in schools and on television, but, at home as well. Parents need to protect their children and teach them not just the values of this technology that's around us, but also the problems and how they need to perceive, how they need to be aware of how what they say online can, jeopardize their chances of getting into Harvard, for example.
There's two things I'm going to say to this. First of all, I think it's really interesting when you talk about education outside of just schools and then where else the education needs to happen. And the first thing that popped into my mind was in terms of driver's license and the fact that once you've passed your driving test, most people from that point onwards start becoming a worse driver because they don't... Well, it's true. They don't adhere to all of the things that they were originally taught when they passed their driving test. If you ask somebody to pass their driving test again, years later after they've actually originally passed it, most people have learned so many bad habits, they probably wouldn't pass again. But that's the interesting thing is that there is that idea of, we understand at one point in time what might be good or bad about something or what we should be doing, but because we don't keep ourselves updated about these things, and certainly the majority of parents and people who are out there working in the world, they're not revisiting these things, they're just kind of learning as they go, and that doesn't always lead to understanding in a way that they necessarily could or should be understanding. But having said that, I want to jump back to something else that Sandra said, which I think is really fascinating and really interesting, and I want to throw this one out, especially to you, Pete, as well. But I am curious. So Sanj made the comment, and I know you've said this before, Sanj, about the fact that people like Facebook and Google have more access and more insight to data than most of our governments do. And so this leads me to a logical question, and we don't like to usually get political on this show, but I am really curious. In the US, there has been some talk around the idea that there is going to be an introduction of a new requirement for the Borders and Customs Control to be able to require access to your social media accounts so that they can find out what kind of person you are and what you've been talking about. And a lot of people were very, up in arms. They were very offended by the idea of this invasion of privacy and the fact that you have to hand over the keys to all of your social media kingdoms and let the government have a little bit of a rummage. And yet somebody who is not the government, somebody like Facebook or Google or YouTube, already has access to that data, if not even more data, because they're connecting all the dots. They've got not just what you're doing from a social media perspective, but basically anything you do in the digital domain. So I'm kind of curious whether or not that this is just purely a perception issue, or whether or not there is really a significant difference in the idea of the government asking for access to this information versus somebody like Facebook or Google asking for this information. What say you, Pete?
That's a very big question. My initial reaction is, I mean, obviously Facebook and Google and everyone have this information. You've signed a contract with them to give them that information. And if you're responsible, you've read that contract before you've signed it and you understand what you're doing. And there probably are kind of protocols and features within those products that allow you to switch off certain things and have some control over it. I mean, what really happens to our data? Some people don't know, and that is perhaps a worry, and I'm very careful how I manage my social media. In terms of the government having access, that scares me. I read the books when I was at school, and that future is scary. I don't know if I trust Facebook or the government anymore. I don't know how I feel about Facebook having it versus the government having it, but just the idea of the government having access to me makes me feel uncomfortable. So that's a personal response. The big question is, I think there has to be something that allows us as individuals to manage what data is available, and and then we have to have the trust in those companies to manage our data as we're asking them to manage our data. But those companies survive based on the data they collect, and the data they collect allows them to provide a better service. So that is the trade-off.
Sanj,
I'm not answering the question.
He's avoiding the question. Sanj, what's your thoughts on this interesting topic?
I mean, it's an interesting thing because the US announced that recently.
Yes.
But in Russia, that kind of process has already been happening, and it's been happening for quite a few years. And there's been an arms race between loads of major nations all over the world, since the dawn of time, who has the most powerful gun. And data at the moment, and I'm not trying to throw a sinister kind of shroud on this fantastic technology, revolution that we're all having at the moment, but data has become a weapon. And we all know, what's been happening with the elections in the States and also in around Europe. And there is some evidence, and I read an amazing feature that was in, I think, the last issue of Wired about that, and how there was some claims that Putin and his team had basically been working on this kind of data artificial intelligent weapon that's basically controlling, or is basically starting fires within these social media echo chambers that we all exist in now, because you get on a train in the morning, everyone's on their phone, and that's a powerful thing. And the US have seen what's been happening, and they're starting to galvanize their approach, and this is part of that approach. Now, us four on this conversation, we believe that data is sacred because they are thoughts, they are things that we think about and we say, and sometimes we say things that upset people, and your friends look at that and may be upset, but they're your friends, so they respect it to a certain extent. But governments don't do that. They're looking for ways to not just understand people, but also to point the finger and say, you can't do that. That's how it's perceived anyway. I mean, I don't know. I've never worked in government. I don't know what they may be the nicest people in the world, but there's this kind of thought that if a government has access to that information, they're going to judge you in ways that you don't want to be judged. And that is an issue. That is a problem, but it's a part of this evolution that we're going to have to kind of deal with. When the Facebook revolution happened in the sort of late noughties, there were some people that were committing suicide when Facebook blocked them. And people were saying to Facebook, look, you have a responsibility to this information, because this information is people's lives. And that's the duty that governments will have to have if they have access to that information. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but it's interesting and it's happening now. And it's a bloody war, and it's causing problems.
Mike, I'm curious from your anthropological view, what you think.
One of the things I do is I'm interested in sort of studying political violence. I mean, outbreaks of riots and other forms of political violence, and I'm very struck by what Sandra was just saying about Putin and the use of rumour mills in the internet. And indeed, just thinking of Britain last week, there was an extraordinary rumour going around in some of the kind of nuttier fringes that the government had put a blocking notice on news about the numbers of deaths in Grenfell Tower, the tower block that burned down in London last week. I mean, it was a total fantasy, but this rumour spread viciously, and rumour has a real force in moments of crowd destabilization. When you're trying to understand how riots take place in, say, Indian elections, the role of rumour and deliberate spreading of misinformation is absolutely crucial in that, because rumour is untraceable and it feeds for various forms of panic. But I mean, that said, and that's there, it's a real problem, and we've got to think about it. I come at it mostly from the other angle. I mean, UCL hosts a number of huge data sets which have been created since the Second World War in what's called longitudinal health data studies, using the fact that most people use the National Health Service and feel grateful for getting free treatment. Effectively, what the NHS has done is ask large cohorts of people to give huge amounts of health data over the course of their lives in order for us to be able to work out who gets dementia, who gets cancer, what life course factors are there that shape the outcomes of people's lives in terms of health. And those projects have been hugely successful. And indeed, there's a lot of hope here in the medical establishment and the universities, but especially at UCL, that we can use digital gathering, digital harvesting of mass data on an even bigger scale to work out what are the connections that people can't make so easily between behaviors and particular health outcomes. And those things are, of course, there's a risk because of insurance. Is it going to be harder to get insurance if you've had two parents who've died of lung cancer or whatever, let's say without them being smokers? But on the other hand, at a population level, there's just unbelievable potential for preventing outbreaks of diseases, for controlling life choice influenced health conditions. So I'm pretty happy about those possibilities. I think, but indeed, as both Sanj and Peter have been saying, it's about keeping the population on board by having conversations that we should have been having 20 or even more years ago.
Okay, so on that basis, I suppose the one thing I would ask is what do you think needs to happen, be it a technological thing or a cultural thing? What is the big shift that needs to occur in order to change the perception of technology or the attitude towards technology in order to, as you say, have that conversation that was supposed to have happened 20 years ago? What is that big thing that could or should be happening? And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on that, Sanj.
I think there just needs to be more investment, in the development of people to use this technology. I think one of the reasons people are worried about governments having access to this information is because they don't know who has access to this information. They don't know anything about the people. There's that kind of famous quote about, well, I know everyone's looking at me, but who's looking at the people that are looking at me? And that I think that there just needs to be some investment. I've been through border control in the US, and generally everyone's really, really cool, but there is that odd person that's a little bit, I don't know, maybe having a bad day and may not like the look of you, and that kind of judgment applied to data or applied to their perception of data could have very dangerous consequences. So it's just something that just needs to be thought about. Okay.
And Mike, what's your thoughts on this?
I share Sanjay's view. I think the thing that could really change things is just in terms of Britain, if kids going through schools weren't taught in computer science how to operate Microsoft Office, but were taught to understand writing code, how computers work, better statistical reasoning, understanding big data in a practical sense of actually beginning to use it themselves. And more broadly, it seems to me that in higher education, that's one of our tasks, is to enable people to become sort of digital citizens. To become mistresses and masters of this world that could spin out of control, but that offers such incredible potential to all of us. So it's about training and education. In the longer term, in the shorter term, for me, it's fingers crossed that we don't have a kind of Bristol baby organ disaster scaring people away from sharing big data.
Okay. Digital citizens. I like the sound of this. Pete, what's your thoughts?
I'm going to go the digital citizens route as well. But the first thing that I'd say is, technology is now that position where, the artificial intelligence and machine learning is clever enough to actually add value to our lives. The input to that, whether that be kind of gesture or voice recognition, is getting to that stage where it's also smart enough. So it kind of feels that's really exciting because those systems, the front end and the back end, are in place now. I think in terms of it moving to the next level, and this is where, Michael's really important from a professor perspective, we're starting to see those people who have grown up with digital, who are going to be the true digital citizens. They're soon going to be in the workplace and they're going to be creating the products. And they've gone through a world which was digital, and that might not be quite happening yet, but it's going to be happening soon. it's going to be fascinating to see what products they come out with, because they're the ones that have grown up not knowing anything else. Been taught digital in school, have learned it by hacking and using it their own way. Technology is a huge thing now. We didn't grow up in that era, so we're coming at it from a previous perspective and trying to apply our own rules onto it. The next workplace audience are going to be the ones that have grown up with it as part of their everyday language, and they're going to be digital citizens, the true digital citizens, and the ones that I think create amazing products. So we could all be out of a job soon, Tanya and Sanj. I think it's going to be amazing when they're there and they're the ones creating the products. I think it's going to be really, really cool.
Okay. Well, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about what you're up to. And we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. What would that be, Pete?
I'm Peter at Peter Robinson81 on Twitter.
And Sanj, what would yours be?
So you can get me on Twitter either on Tiger Heart Tech, which is TigerHeartTech, or you could get me on Sanj Surati, which is SanjSurati.
Wonderful. And Mike, what about you?
This shows my age and my generation, but if you look me up on Open City Documentary Festival on Facebook, that's an easy way to reach me or any member of my team.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com